Now, our video application currently only displays the list of movies. It would be nice if we could click on a movie and see its details. So the first thing we need to do is to define a URL that takes a parameter, like movies/1, where 1 is the ID of a movie. So back in VS Code, in our Movies app, let's open up urls.py. Here we need to define a new URL pattern. So let's call the path function. As the first argument, we're going to pass a string like this. We use angle brackets to define a parameter. Let's call that movie_ID. Now, to refresh your memory, earlier I told you that the main URLs module in our project hands off any URLs that starts with movies/ to this URLs module in the Movies app. Let's take a look. So here in the vidly folder, let's open up urls.py. So here we define a URL pattern. So we're telling Django that any URL that starts with movies/ should be handed off to the URLs module in the Movies app. Now, back to the Movies app. When we add a parameter here, that represents a URL that looks like this, because all the URLs we're working with in this module start with movies/. Okay? Now, we need to map this to a view function. So views, let's call that detail. Currently, we don't have that, but we're going to create it soon. Now, as a best practice, we should also give it a name. These names are useful in situations where we have multiple references to a URL. Let's say /movies/1. Now, for whatever reason, we decide to change this URL to something like this. Let's say old system/movies/1. If you have multiple references, multiple hard-coded references to a URL like this, then we'll have to update all those references to the new URL. So that's why we use names here. These names should uniquely identify URLs. So in our templates, instead of hard coding these URLs, we reference them with their names. And then in the future, if you want to change the URL, we can change it in a single place. I'm going to show you that later in this section. So back to the business, let's call this detail. And also, as a best practice, it's better to namespace these names. So movies_detail and movies_index. So this is our URL pattern. Now let's go ahead and create this view function. So if you're on Mac, press Command and P. If you're on Windows, press Control P and search for views in the Movies app. Okay, now let's add a new view function. We call that detail. It takes a request and also a parameter called movie ID, because in our URL pattern, we use the keyword movie ID. So when we send a request to, let's say, movies/1, Django will automatically extract 1, and then it will call this view function and pass 1 as an argument for movie ID. Okay, so for now, let's just return an HTTP response with this movie ID. Save the changes. Back in the browser, let's head over to movies/1. So we get 1 here. Let's change this to 2. Beautiful. Everything is working. However, I can pass a non-numeric value like A, and that also gets passed as the movie ID. But as you know, in our model, our movie IDs are integers. Look, here's our movies table. The first column is ID, and it's an integer. So by default, Django uses an integer for primary keys, but we can always change that if we want to. So back to the URLs module. Here I'm going to use a type converter to convert this value to an integer. So we prefix that with int:. Save the changes. Now, back in the browser, if we pass A as the movie ID, let's see what happens. Django cannot find that page. So this is some level of protection. We can ensure that we only get numeric values for our movie ID parameter. Now let's change this back to 1. Beautiful. So in the next lecture, we're going to get the movie object with this ID and render it on this page.